Billionaire's daughter falsely accuses her father's driver, but what her mother did shocked them all. Chloe walked down the hallway to the driver's room, humming a soft tune as she made her way toward the door. She had a message from her father to deliver, and she was in no hurry. When she reached the door, without knocking, she turned the doorknob and stepped inside. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. Thomas, the family driver, had just come out of the bathroom. He wasn't wearing anything. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She stood frozen, her heart racing as she stared at him. Thomas froze too, his face turning pale as he realized what had happened. I didn't know you were here," he stammered, his voice shaky. He quickly rushed back into the bathroom and grabbed a towel. Moments later, Thomas emerged, the towel wrapped around his waist. But Chloe didn't move. She stood there, still staring at him with a gaze that felt unnervingly heavy. "Please," Thomas said, his voice nervous. "Could you step out?" But Chloe didn't answer. She continued to watch him, her eyes locked on him, as if searching for something, anything, behind his hurried motions. Thomas shifted uncomfortably under her stare, anxiety crawling up his spine. "I didn't hear you come in. Please, step out," he repeated, his voice now barely a whisper. Chloe nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She took a quiet step back and gently closed the door behind her. Thomas stood still, breathing a deep sigh of relief. He had narrowly avoided something that could have escalated, but what he didn't know was that this brief encounter was the start of something far bigger. Chloe's lingering stare was just the beginning, the first crack in a past filled with secrets, accusations, and revenge that was now set into motion. Chloe sat in her room, her mind racing. The image of Thomas, standing naked in his room, kept replaying in her head. She couldn't shake the memory of him, the way the towel had barely covered him, and how his presence had felt almost overpowering. His broad shoulders, his defined muscles, and the way he had filled the room. But it wasn't just his size that lingered. It was the raw vulnerability he had exposed in that moment. For a brief second, she saw him differently, not as the driver she had always looked down on, but as a man. Her heartbeat quickened, and she shifted on her bed, the thought of him settling deep in her chest. She closed her eyes, imagining what it would be like to feel his strength close to her, to let him take control. Her breath caught at the thought, her pulse racing as a forbidden desire rose within her. What was it about him? The way he had looked at her, how his voice had trembled when he asked her to leave. Had he been embarrassed, or was there something else? For the first time, she wondered if he had seen her as more than just the spoiled daughter of her father.
The thought of Thomas, naked in front of her, stirred something deep inside. She fantasized about stepping back into his room, the tension between them thick with unspoken promises. The fantasy consumed her, and the more she thought about it, the more she wanted him. She imagined the power he could have over her, the way he could make her feel, things she had never allowed herself to consider. But no, she couldn't think like that. He was just the driver, her father's employee. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts aside. But the more she tried, the more they resurfaced. Determined to regain control, Chloe stood up from the bed. She needed to deliver the message from her father, but her plans had shifted. She couldn't just let this moment go. Chloe stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her blouse, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the fabric over her chest. The encounter earlier that day was still fresh in her mind, and despite her best efforts to push it away, the image of Thomas standing in nothing but a towel kept resurfacing. The way his eyes had widened, the nervous tension in his body, it all had an impact on her. She had never seen him like that, and it stirred something inside her that she couldn't ignore. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before walking toward the door. She paused just before reaching it, running her fingers through her hair. She couldn't deny it any longer, she wanted him. Chloe knocked softly on Thomas's door, trying to sound casual as she called out, "Thomas?" Moments later, the door opened, and Thomas appeared, dressed in his trouser with towel on his neck. His eyes widened as he saw her standing there. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked by a nervous smile. "Chloe," he said, his voice tinged with unease. "What are you doing back here?" Chloe could see the discomfort in his posture, the way he stepped back slightly, as if instinctively trying to distance himself from her. She noticed he was watching her closely, his gaze lingering on her face. Something had changed, and she knew it was because of the way he had seen her earlier. She wasn't surprised, she had been staring at him, unable to look away. And now, that same intensity had carried over into this moment. Chloe's expression softened, but her words were deliberate. "I have a message from my father," she said, her voice steady, though a hint of mischief lingered beneath it. Thomas nodded, his features tight. "Okay," he replied quickly, his voice shaky. He seemed relieved by her message, but his discomfort was still evident. He didn't seem eager to let her in, to continue their conversation. "All right," Chloe said, stepping back as if she were about to leave. But then, she paused, taking a breath. There was something she couldn't leave unsaid.
In one fluid motion, Chloe turned back and pushed the door open further, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She took a few steps toward Thomas, her gaze unwavering, locking onto him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. "I want you," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but filled with undeniable determination. Thomas stood frozen, shock and disbelief written all over his face. His eyes widened, his mouth opened and closed as if trying to find the words. What are you saying?" he stammered, his mind racing, struggling to process what was happening. Chloe took a step closer, her body language confident, despite the slight flutter in her chest. "It's not right," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chloe, you're just 17. This isn't," Chloe shrugged, dismissing his concerns with a nonchalant flick of her hand. "I don't care," she said simply. Her eyes bore into him, unyielding, as if daring him to argue further. "I want you." The silence that followed was thick with tension, a moment suspended in time. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing for the right words, but nothing seemed to come out. Chloe's declaration hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, one he wasn't sure how to meet. He stood there, unsure of what to do. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, the rapid thumping echoing in his ears. He shook his head quickly, disbelief flashing across his face. His voice cracked with panic as he tried to reason with her. No, Chloe, don't say that," he stammered, his words coming out in a rush. "This is wrong. I'm engaged, and you're too young for this, you're just 17. But Chloe didn't back down. She stood there, unwavering, a cold determination in her eyes. Her gaze never left his as she stepped closer, her body language bold and assertive. "If you don't do what I want," she said, her voice low and firm, "I'll tell my dad you forced me." Thomas's face went pale. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to disappear. You can't do that," he whispered, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You can't accuse me of something like that." His mind raced, but there was no escaping the fear that gripped him. Chloe didn't reply. She simply moved closer, her steps slow but deliberate. Now, standing inches away from him, she locked her eyes onto his, her gaze fierce, almost daring him to stop her. Thomas felt a wave of panic crash over him. His thoughts blurred as he reached out instinctively, his hands trembling, and gently pushed her away. "Chloe, stop," he begged, his voice desperate. "This isn't right." But Chloe didn't listen. She stumbled back, but quickly regained her balance. The anger on her face was unmistakable now. With a sudden movement, she grabbed the hem of her dress and pulled it apart, ripping it violently. "Help! Help!" Chloe screamed, her voice shrill with terror. "He's hurting me! Help!"
Thomas's heart stopped. He felt his world tilt as Chloe's words tore through the air. What was she doing? The panic that rose in his chest felt suffocating, and in a panic, he rushed toward her, his hands outstretched, trying to stop the chaos she was creating. "Chloe, stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This isn't what you think. Stop it." But Chloe didn't stop. Her screams only grew louder, echoing through the walls, bouncing off the corners of the room. Thomas's hands shook as he reached for her, trying to cover her mouth to stop the loud cries. "Please, Chloe, stop shouting," he pleaded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Please, please." But Chloe pushed him away with surprising strength. She was frantic, her arms flailing as she fought against him, her voice getting louder, piercing the air. Every second felt like an eternity, and Thomas's desperation mounted. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as Chloe's cries reverberated around them. Suddenly, the door crashed open with a deafening bang, snapping Thomas out of his frantic attempts to quiet her. His body went rigid as he turned toward the door, his breath hitching. There stood Mr. Raymond, Chloe's father, his face twisted in rage. His eyes were wide with fury, his wild gaze taking in the scene before him. The shock on his face mirrored Thomas's own panic. Thomas stood frozen, caught between his fear of the situation and the overwhelming guilt that gnawed at him. His heart pounded in his chest as he quickly glanced down at himself. He was only in his trousers, his hands still trembling from trying to calm Chloe. She stood in front of him, disheveled and terrified, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, the room was silent. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. Thomas's mind raced as he tried to find the words, but nothing came. The weight of the moment hung over him like a heavy fog. "Mr. Raymond's voice shattered the silence. "What is going on here?" he roared, his tone so filled with rage that it seemed to shake the very walls of the room. His voice was an explosion, the raw fury in it impossible to ignore. "What have you done, Thomas?" Thomas's mouth went dry, his heart sinking in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. How could he explain? What could he say? The room seemed to close in on him as Mr. Raymond's furious gaze bore into him. This was a nightmare, and Thomas knew he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Thomas stepped back, his hands raised defensively. "Sir, please, it's not what it looks like," he stammered, his voice shaking with fear and confusion. "I swear, I didn't do anything." He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as panic began to cloud his thoughts. Chloe, standing nearby, rushed to her father's side. As the weight of the situation crashed down on him, the door burst open, and two officers rushed in. Thomas was still on his knees, his heart in his throat, his tears mixing with the desperation in his eyes. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear: his life, as he knew it, was over. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as Mr. Raymond pointed at him, his face a mask of rage. "Arrest him," he shouted, his voice filled with fury. "He forced himself on my daughter." Thomas was still on his knees, tears streaming down his face as he desperately tried to explain himself. "Please, I didn't do anything. You have to believe me." His voice cracked, but the officers were unmoved. They approached him with cold indifference, and before he could say another word, they clamped handcuffs tightly around his wrists, dragging him toward their van. His cries of innocence fell on deaf ears as the officers shoved him into the vehicle, and no one spared him a second glance. Later that evening, at the police station, Emma arrived. Her face was swollen from crying, her eyes red and puffy. The moment she spotted Thomas, she rushed to him, her heart in her eyes. "Tell me it's not true, Thomas," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please tell me it's just a misunderstanding." "I'm innocent, honey," Thomas sobbed, trying to explain himself, his words coming out in broken gasps. Emma's expression softened, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "It's okay," she said, her voice full of assurance. "I know you could never do something like that. We'll get through this." Hearing her words, a wave of relief washed over Thomas. He clung to the hope that Emma believed him, that she could see the truth through the lies. "Lucy believes me too," she added gently. "She knows you'd never hurt anyone." The mention of their daughter made Thomas break down even further, his body shaking with sobs. It was the one thing that kept him going, the thought of his family, his little girl, who trusted him. Back at home, Mr. Raymond had just returned, his face tense with frustration. His wife, Anna, rushed to him the moment she saw him, worry etched on her face. "Honey, I came home immediately." "Why was everyone already at the station?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Mr. Raymond sighed, exhaustion in his eyes. "How's Chloe?" he asked, needing to know that his daughter was okay. "She's resting now," Anna replied softly, trying to ease his mind. "She's been through a lot, but I've been able to calm her down." Mr. Raymond nodded, but his disappointment was evident. "I can't believe Thomas. I'm so disappointed in him." Anna hesitated. She, too, felt the weight of betrayal, but she was not ready to dismiss the possibility that there might be more to the story. "Yes, I feel the same, but we need to hear Thomas's side. You know, there are always three sides to a story: the accused, the accuser, and the truth." Mr. Raymond turned sharply toward her, his frustration flaring. "Are you saying my daughter is lying? Is that what you're implying?" "No, honey," Anna said quickly, her voice steady but filled with concern. "I'm just asking you not to rush to judgment. Please, don't get more angry." She watched as her husband walked away, his back stiff with unresolved anger. Later that evening, Mr. Raymond arrived at the police station, his mind swirling with confusion. As he entered, Thomas saw him immediately and shouted his name. "Sir, please listen to me." His voice trembled with desperation. Mr. Raymond hesitated. He was so torn, unsure of who to believe, his heart heavy with confusion. After what felt like an eternity, he walked toward Thomas, his eyes filled with conflict. "What is it, Thomas? Tell me." Mr. Raymond's voice was tight, desperate for some clarity. "I swear, sir," Thomas began, his voice raw with emotion. "Your daughter, she tried to get me to sleep with her. I refused. She threatened to accuse me if I didn't. I'm innocent. Please believe me." His voice cracked with the weight of his words, each syllable feeling like a heavy blow to his already shattered soul. Mr. Raymond stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing, the words making no sense to him. He wanted to believe Thomas, but his heart, his gut, told him otherwise. He shook his head in disbelief. "You're lying, Thomas," he spat, his voice breaking with pain. "I trusted you. I treated you like family, and this is how you repay me?" Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes as he sank to his knees, his hands trembling. "Please, I didn't do it," he cried, his voice hoarse. "I'm a father. I have a 2-year-old daughter. I could never do something like this." But Mr. Raymond walked away, his heart breaking with every step. Thomas's confession echoed in his mind, each word pulling him deeper into a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. He wanted to believe Thomas, but his daughter's cries of pain rang in his ears, drowning out everything else. Emma arrived at the mansion, her arms wrapped tightly around their baby, Lucy, as she made her way to the front door. Her face was a picture of desperation and sorrow. She had to do this, she had to plead on Thomas's behalf. She couldn't let him suffer for something he didn't do. As she entered the living room, she spotted Mr. Raymond sitting with Anna, his expression stern and angry. "Sir, please," Emma said, her voice shaky as she placed Lucy down. "You have to believe me. Thomas is innocent. He could never do what your daughter accused him of." Mr. Raymond's face hardened at the sound of her words. His eyes flashed with irritation as he stood abruptly, pushing his chair back so forcefully it almost tipped over. "I don't want to hear it," he bellowed, his anger bubbling over. "Get out, Emma. You've come here to defend a man who betrayed me. You've come here to defend a monster." Emma took a step back, her chest tightening with both fear and heartbreak. "But I know him better than anyone. Thomas would never," I said. "Get out." Mr. Raymond shouted, his voice cracking with fury. His eyes, once filled with warmth for Emma, now held nothing but disdain. Anna stood frozen, her heart aching for Emma, for Thomas, for everything that had spiraled out of control. When she glanced down at the baby, her heart broke. Is this the last time Lucy will see her father? The thought weighed heavily on her. Emma was still pleading, but the words didn't seem to reach Mr. Raymond, who had already turned away from her. Anna, her voice soft, spoke to Emma with a mix of compassion and resolve. "Please, go home, Emma. We will look into everything. I promise. Just, go home." Emma nodded, tears in her eyes, and picked up Lucy, walking toward the door with a broken heart. Anna watched her leave, knowing that the family was being torn apart by a lie that no one seemed able to see through. Meanwhile, Mr. Raymond went upstairs to Chloe's room. He needed to check on her, to make sure she was all right after everything that had happened. The moment he entered, Chloe sat up from the bed, her eyes red from crying. "How are you feeling?" Mr. Raymond asked gently, sitting on the edge of her bed. He needed to know that she was okay, that she wasn't being affected by the weight of what was happening. But more than that, he needed to know if she was truly telling the truth about Thomas. "Are you sure about what you said about Thomas?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. "Because, Chloe, if he didn't do this, if you lied, it means you've sent a man to prison, away from his family for something he didn't do." His words hung in the air, a heavy truth neither of them wanted to confront. Chloe flinched, her face tightening with guilt. Her father's words cut deeper than she had anticipated, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Not now. She needed to hold on to the lie, even if it tore her apart. I'm sure," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm telling the truth, Daddy. You sent me to deliver a message to him, and when I did, her voice broke as she tried to hold back the tears. He wouldn't listen. I told him no, but he tried to force himself on me." But as she said the words, something in her shifted. She couldn't ignore the guilt gnawing at her, the uncertainty in her chest. Was it really worth it to see Thomas locked away forever for something that wasn't his fault? Downstairs, Anna was in the CCTV room, reviewing the footage. Her heart was heavy as she rewound the video, hoping beyond hope that it would give her the answers she needed. She watched Chloe as she entered Thomas's room, and for the first time, she noticed something strange. Chloe had arranged herself before entering, adjusting her clothes and looking around as if preparing for something. Then, she forced her way into the room the second time. Suspicion crept into Anna's mind, but doubt quickly followed. Could it be true? Could her own daughter have set Thomas up for something he didn't do? There wasn't enough evidence, not enough to make Raymond believe her against his daughter. Back upstairs, Mr. Raymond was still sitting with Chloe, watching her intently. His heart was conflicted, his mind torn between his daughter and the doubts that now clouded his judgment. "Are you sure, Chloe?" he asked one last time, his voice trembling with the weight of the situation. Chloe didn't answer right away. She simply looked away, tears streaming down her face, as the guilt and confusion she had buried deep within her began to surface. She had to hold on to the lie. She couldn't go back now. Anna made up her mind. She couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. She had to get the truth from Chloe, no matter what. Her heart weighed heavy as she made her way upstairs. When she entered Chloe's room, she found Mr. Raymond sitting beside their daughter, comforting her as she cried. "How's she feeling?" Anna asked, her voice gentle, though there was a simmering tension beneath the calm. Chloe looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I'm fine, Mom. I don't know what to do anymore." Anna's heart twisted, but she forced herself to remain composed. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Chloe, how could you?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "How could you do such a thing?" Chloe looked up at her mother, confusion flooding her expression. "Mom, what do you mean?" Raymond, who had been silently observing, now looked at Anna with a furrowed brow. He was just as curious as Chloe, but his confusion only deepened as Anna's words hit a chord. "I just went through the footage," Anna said quietly but firmly, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Chloe. "And I saw everything." Chloe's heart skipped a beat, her chest tightening with panic. Anna continued, her voice tinged with shock, "How you forced your way into his room, and, oh my God, Chloe." Mr. Raymond's face shifted from concern to confusion as he turned to his wife. "What are you talking about? What footage?" Anna's expression hardened, her disappointment clear. "I saw the footage, Raymond." "Chloe, you need to start telling the truth right now, because if you don't, your dad will go watch it for himself." Chloe's mind raced. She couldn't let Raymond see that footage. It would expose everything. Her stomach churned with guilt, but she couldn't back out now. "Mom, please," she whispered, her voice faltering. Anna's eyes softened for a moment before she looked away, disappointed. "There's a camera in all the rooms in this house, Chloe. Just in case of situations like this. And I'm deeply disappointed in you." Chloe felt the weight of her mother's words crush her. The realization that her mother knew, really knew, what had happened made her stomach turn. She knew now that there was no escaping this. Anna turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy as she left Chloe standing there, a broken mess of emotions. As the door closed behind her, Mr. Raymond turned to Chloe. His voice was quieter now, filled with confusion. "What is your mom saying, Chloe?" Chloe wiped her tears and opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her thoughts were scattered. She couldn't even process the reality of what she had done. She had to say something, anything, to make her father understand. But the guilt weighed her down. It was him, Daddy. He tried to force himself on me," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. But Mr. Raymond looked at her, his face filled with pain, trying to make sense of the situation. "That's not what your mom saw, Chloe. That's not what the footage shows. I need to know the truth, from you." Chloe began to cry harder, her sobs breaking through her fragile composure. She didn't want to lie anymore, but she also couldn't bring herself to tell her father what she had done. "Please, Daddy. Please," she begged, but her words hung in the air, unfinished. Mr. Raymond's face shifted from concern to confusion as he turned to his wife. "What are you talking about? What footage?" Anna's expression hardened, her disappointment clear. "I saw the footage, Raymond. Chloe, you need to start telling the truth right now, because if you don't, your dad will go watch it for himself." Chloe's mind raced. She couldn't let Raymond see that footage. It would expose everything. Her stomach churned with guilt, but she couldn't beat back out now. "Mom, please," she whispered, her voice faltering. Anna's eyes softened for a moment before she looked away, disappointed. "There's a camera in all the rooms in this house, Chloe. Just in case of situations like this. And I'm deeply disappointed in you." Chloe felt the weight of her mother's words crush her. The realization that her mother knew, really knew, what had happened made her stomach turn. She knew now that there was no escaping this. Anna turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy as she left Chloe standing there, a broken mess of emotions. As the door closed behind her, Mr. Raymond turned to Chloe. His voice was quieter now, filled with confusion. "What is your mom saying, Chloe?" Chloe wiped her tears and opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her thoughts were scattered. She couldn't even process the reality of what she had done. She had to say something, anything, to make her father understand. But the guilt weighed her down. It was him, Daddy. He tried to force himself on me," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. But Mr. Raymond looked at her, his face filled with pain, trying to make sense of the situation. "That's not what your mom saw, Chloe. That's not what the footage shows. I need to know the truth, from you." Chloe began to cry harder, her sobs breaking through her fragile composure. She didn't want to lie anymore, but she also couldn't bring herself to tell her father what she had done. "Please, Daddy, please," she begged, but her words hung in the air, unfinished. Processing the situation in their own way. He sat beside her and looked at her with a mix of confusion and desperation. "How did you know Chloe was lying?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with confusion. "There's no camera in her room. Everything she said was what Thomas had told me. I haven't discussed any of it with you." Anna sighed, rubbing her temples as she gathered her thoughts. "I felt Thomas was innocent," she said quietly, her voice filled with conviction. "When I saw the footage, I could connect the dots. It all made sense. I couldn't let him spend another minute behind bars. I wouldn't want his child to think he was guilty of assault, nor could I allow him to waste his life away in there." Mr. Raymond nodded slowly, a wave of guilt washing over him. "You're right," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm ashamed. I handled it all wrong. I should have trusted my instincts sooner. I'm so disappointed in myself." Anna turned to him, her hand resting on his. "You acted as a father at first," she reassured him. "And that's why you did what you did. It's okay. We'll fix this." Mr. Raymond took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision they now had to make. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice firm but filled with regret, "we'll free Thomas. We'll fix this. I'll call Emma and ask her to come over." Anna nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I'll do that. We'll make sure this is all put right." She squeezed his hand, offering him the support he needed to move forward. Downstairs, Chloe sat in her room, tears staining her cheeks as she cried herself to sleep. The weight of guilt crushed her chest. She had made a terrible mistake, and now, it was too late to undo the damage. As she lay in her bed, the silence in the house felt overwhelming, knowing that she had broken something precious beyond repair. Downstairs, Chloe sat in her room, tears staining her cheeks as she cried herself to sleep. The weight of guilt crushed her chest. She had made a terrible mistake, and now, it was too late to undo the damage. As she lay in her bed, the silence in the house felt overwhelming, knowing that she had broken something precious beyond repair. The following morning, the house felt quieter than ever. Chloe had barely slept, her restless mind tangled in guilt, fear, and the weight of everything that had happened. The silence was deafening. Her parents had spoken little to her since the confrontation. Her mother, Anna, had been distant, and her father, Mr. Raymond, had spent the night in his study, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and regret. But today, the decision had been made. Anna had called Emma, urging her to come to the mansion. Emma, still reeling from the events, had agreed without hesitation. She couldn't shake the hope that Thomas would be coming home soon, that somehow, they could undo the damage Chloe had caused. She arrived at the mansion, Lucy in her arms, the child's face a mixture of innocence and anxiety. When Emma entered the house, she was met with Anna, who had a tired but resolute expression. "We've done everything we can, Emma," Anna said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "The charges will be withdrawn today. Thomas will come home. Emma's face softened with a sigh of relief. Thank you, Mrs. Raymond, she whispered, her heart aching for the man she loved. The idea of him languishing in a prison cell, wrongly accused, had been unbearable, but couldn't help but think, why are they withdrawing the charges so soon? Well, she will have to wait till Thomas get home. Upstairs, Mr. Raymond sat in his study, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was about to do something he never imagined he'd have to, something that no father should have to do. But this wasn't about his pride or his ego anymore. This was about righting a wrong. He looked at the phone in his hand, the number he was about to call. The police station. He had already spoken with the officers earlier, but today, they would see the withdrawal of the charges. Thomas would be free. At the police station, the tension was palpable. Mr. Raymond and Anna stood together, their hands intertwined, their hearts heavy with the decision that had been made. They had come to right the wrongs. It wasn't just about freeing Thomas, it was about saving their family, about healing the wounds that had been inflicted. When they walked into the station, Emma was waiting, her eyes filled with both relief and trepidation. She clung to Lucy, the child's small form providing her with some comfort in the midst of the chaos. Mr. Raymond, Mrs. Raymond, the officer said, acknowledging their presence. You're here to withdraw the charges, correct? Mr. Raymond nodded solemnly, his jaw clenched. Yes, he replied, his voice firm but strained. We are withdrawing the charges against Thomas. The officer nodded, immediately beginning the paperwork to release Thomas. Within moments, the decision had been made, and Thomas would be free to return home. Back at the mansion, Chloe sat alone in her room, the walls feeling like they were closing in on her. Her guilt was suffocating. She had hoped, in some small part of her heart, that by the time this day was over, everything would have returned to normal. But the truth was, she couldn't escape what she had done. And it was too late to undo it. She could hear the sounds of her parents speaking downstairs, the distant laughter of Lucy, and the soft murmurs of Emma's voice. Chloe could hear it all, but she felt disconnected from it, as though she were no longer part of the world she had once known. Then, her parents entered the room. Anna's expression was a mix of sadness and understanding, while Mr. Raymond's face was filled with a quiet resolve. Chloe looked up, her tear-streaked face a picture of regret. Chloe, Mr. Raymond said softly, his voice filled with pain, I want you to know that what happened yesterday, what you did, it was a mistake. And we will move forward, but you have to take responsibility for your actions. Chloe nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Anna stepped forward, her arms open. Chloe hesitated for a moment, then collapsed into her mother's arms, her sobs racking her body. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she cried. It's okay, Anna whispered, holding her tightly. We'll fix this. Together. But you need to learn from this, Chloe. You need to learn that your actions have consequences. Later that day, Thomas was released from the police station. Emma rushed to him, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. You're free, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You're finally free. Thomas held her close, his chest tight with emotion. I thought I'd lost everything, he whispered. I thought I'd never come home. Emma kissed him softly. You're out now, honey. The air felt heavy as Thomas arrived back at the mansion. His heart was still reeling from the events of the past day, the surreal sensation of being wrongfully accused and now, finally, being free. As he stepped inside, the familiar surroundings of the Raymond household felt different, colder, quieter, as if something had shifted permanently. Mr. Raymond was waiting for him in the foyer. His face was a mixture of regret and guilt, his posture stiff with the weight of the apology he knew he had to offer. Without hesitation, Mr. Raymond stepped forward, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thomas," he said, his tone low, "I owe you an apology. I failed you. I let my emotions cloud my judgment, and I should have trusted you from the start." His eyes met Thomas's, filled with remorse. "I'm sorry for what happened." Thomas met his gaze, the years of loyalty and respect between them now tainted by the lies that had almost ruined his life. Still, he nodded, accepting the apology. "It's not easy to trust again after something like this," Thomas said quietly. "But I appreciate your words." Just then, Chloe entered the room, her eyes red from crying. She approached him slowly, her hands trembling. Without saying a word, she knelt down in front of him, her head bowed in shame. "Thomas, I don't know what came over me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Please, can you find it in your heart to forgive me?" Thomas stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her apology heavy in the air. He could see the regret in her eyes, but something inside him had shifted. He had never imagined this moment would come, and yet here they were, both so broken. He took a deep breath and shook his head slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Chloe," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I won't press charges. I won't destroy your life over something that was a mistake, even though it cost me so much. I'm not sure I can move past this." He looked at Mr. Raymond and Anna, his gaze softening just slightly. "You've done the right thing by releasing me, and for that, I thank you." Chloe stood up, still crying, her heart heavy with the knowledge that forgiveness might never come. "I understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. Thomas turned toward the door, his heart still torn but knowing what he had to do. He walked toward the hallway, ready to leave the mansion in his position as the Raymonds' trusted driver behind him. He stopped at the doorway, turning to face Mr. Raymond one last time. "I'm resigning," he said quietly, his words final. "I can't stay here anymore." Mrs. Raymond nodded slowly, understanding the depth of his pain. She didn't try to stop him, knowing there was nothing she could say to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Mr. Raymond, though filled with guilt, reached for his checkbook. "Let me offer you something," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "It's the least I can do for the suffering you've endured." But Thomas refused, shaking his head firmly. "No. I don't want your money," he said. "I just need to walk away from all of this." He picked up his coat, his movements stiff but resolute. As he walked toward the door, Emma appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with relief as she rushed to him. She embraced him tightly, her body shaking with the weight of the emotions she had held back for days. "You believed in me," Thomas whispered into her ear, taking his baby girl Lucy from her, his voice breaking. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Emma smiled through her tears, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "We'll always believe in you," she said. "Now let's go home." Thomas kissed her back, feeling the weight of the past day begin to lift. It was over, and it wouldn't be easy, but they would face the future together with love and hope. It wouldn't be a perfect life, but it would be his, and that was enough. Which country are you watching from? Please don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Thanks for watching.